Welcoming back Dr. Peterson for kind of our third and final installment of this talk. So it's been fascinating, and this week he promised us last week we would talk about God. So we're going to do a little of that this week as well. I know you don't want to, but if you would ask your questions in the microphone, and I know people are like, I don't need it, I've got a big mouth. And yes, some of you do have big mouths, but it's actually because we're recording the class, and a lot of people who are out of town have asked us to record it, and so we can't record your question if you don't ask it into the microphone. So if you have a question, just kind of simply raise your hand, and we'll have somebody usher you a microphone very quickly for those questions. And nothing else, turn it over to Dr. Peterson. Thank you for being back with us this morning.
Good to be here. All right. Well, good morning, all. I was just talking with one of the folks here today. I know that some of you took me up on the invitation to come hear Professor Sean Hopwood on Thursday night. How many of you did that? Or? Okay, and so you knew it. We had a standing ovation at the end, right? It was quite the evening. So I'm glad that you all could come. That's terrific. I got really hot last time, so I'm going to take my coat off. Okay, so we're going to talk more about CRISPR and genetics and editing genes and how we might think about that. So right off the bat, I want to be sure that we're clear that God has designed nature to be constantly changing. Anybody recognize this particular mountain? It looks like a lot of the mountains in Alaska, very true. This is Mount St. Helens in 1980. Here it is shortly after it exploded. We lost the top half of the elevation. The explosion was so severe, you might very well remember, that it leveled hundreds of square miles of timber. Here's just one example, a picture. And to give you a sense of scale, do you see the two rangers down here? So we're talking about incredibly large forest stands. Nature's constantly changing, and not many of us live on a tropical island where we can just grab dinner out of the sea and eat it raw or sleep under the palm trees. As soon as you have to sharpen a stick to get that fish, or cook it over a fire, or start to lean some palm fronds together, you're doing what human beings do naturally. We naturally change nature around us. We're a lot more like beavers than like vultures. Vultures can just get a high view and watch for their dinner to show up, and largely otherwise leave the rest of nature pretty much alone. Whereas beavers put a dam across a stream. They need the water level to rise so they can get to their food, so they can protect their kits in the den. It's their nature to change nature, to live in nature. That's their part. Right? Human beings are a lot more like that. We have to alter nature around us simply to survive. That's basic to our nature. Now, I'm not saying this to be anthropocentric. I'm not going to in any way suggest that as human beings, the world is here just for us. What I want to be from a Christian perspective is theocentric, to say that the world, the creation, is about who God is and what God is doing. And we're just part of that creation that belongs to God. Before my wife and I moved here to Roanoke, I was on the faculty at McMaster University in Toronto. And part of the Greek seal for the university was this phrase from Colossians chapter 1, verse 17. Let's say I'm sure David could read it, and I won't put you on the spot. I don't know how many Greek readers we have, but it says, all things in Christ synesthekin, hold together. That all of creation has been created through Christ and for Christ and is in Christ and belongs to Christ and finds its fulfillment in Christ. So by this perspective, the world is not God, but this is God's world. Right? This is a world that has been created by and belongs ultimately to God. A famous text that many of you are probably familiar with is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but rather receive eternal life. Now it's really interesting. That text, it's very clear. It doesn't say, for God so loved people. The text is, for God so loved hakosmos, for God so loved the creation, for God so loved all that he created, that he became intimately involved in it from the beginning and all the way through coming to live among us. For God so loves the whole creation, the whole world that he's made. But human beings do have a special place in it. So God created human beings in his own image. We're the only creatures that are described as bearing God's image. So what does that image mean? Well, I'll suggest that there are three aspects to it. And you've probably read and studied this before, so we'll just review. That God's image includes capacity, and it includes relationship, and it includes a particular calling. Right? So what do I mean by capacity? Human beings, like other animals, are from the dust and will return to the dust. Okay, we read that in the Common Book of Prayer, right, as well as Scripture. Human beings are very much of the earth. In fact, the word Adam, Adamah, best translation might be the mud man. Okay, it's the same word as for clay in the Hebrew. So we're very much of the earth in our capacity. But just think how there was at some point a creature that was able to start to discern a difference between light and dark. And then if you quantitatively increase that capacity and refine it, it comes to a qualitative distinction where they could not just sense light and dark, but they could actually see image. And then you have an increasing complexity of quantity to the point where you can start to discern shapes or particular individuals. As the acuity, the ability to see gets greater, that becomes a qualitative distinction. Until you get to human beings, that our sense of sight has quantitatively improved to the point where there's a qualitative, emergent distinction that we can not only see, we can create sights. So here are some pictures by Monet. There are no other animals that can take this quantitative ability of sight to the degree where it becomes qualitatively a new phenomenon, an emergent phenomenon of being able to create beauty and painting as well as appreciate it. Human beings are unique in so many different ways. We're connected to the rest of creation, but we have emergent capacity that we can do things that no other part of creation can do. Among that, that's very important, is I would say that we can know God and we can know that we know God. So capacity is central to the image of God. And then relationship is essential. I think of, for example, John Calvin, when he describes the image of God, he says it's like seeing an image in a mirror. The mirror has to be related to what it's imaging to reflect the image. That part of bearing God's image is that we have a relationship with God, that we are connected with God, we can know God, that we bear his image. There's a relationship there. And then the third aspect is a particular calling, that God not only has a creation where there are human beings in it who have unique capacity, but that they can have a relationship with God and that they have a particular calling that they're to live out in how they represent God in this creation God has made. By the way, just as an example, the words that are used for this image of God are the same ones that are used in many Middle Eastern religions of the time, where the king would place statuary images of himself about the kingdom to represent his presence and power. Okay? We are God's image, God's presence in this creation. So what are we supposed to do? Well, do you notice that Genesis speaks of God placing human beings in a garden, not in a wilderness? All the descriptions of the Garden of Eden are conveying this idea of human beings being part of a garden, not a wilderness. So, a garden requires choices. If you want the roses to thrive, you're going to have to restrain the aphids. And you can't encourage the aphids and the roses. Gardens require choices. You shape a garden. It's still God's garden. But in fact, the text says that human beings have been called to till and to keep the garden. Now, that word till is the same word that's used when Joshua says, "As for me and my house, we will till the Lord." It's not till as in rend or break apart. It's till as in serve, help to flourish, to bless. God gives the assignment to human beings that they are to till, to help to flourish, to serve, to bless the creation. And that word to keep, that's the same word that's used when the blessing is given, "May the good Lord bless and keep you." Okay? So again, it's God gives an assignment that the people in the garden of his creation are to care for it, to help it to flourish, to bless it, to protect it. It's God's garden. Now, as we care for the garden, what is does not necessarily tell us what should be. Remember, the garden has aphids in it, and if you're going to choose to support the roses, you have to restrain the aphids. The way things are doesn't necessarily tell you exactly how it's supposed to ultimately be. We're to care for and develop ourselves and the rest of creation. The way I'd summarize it is we're to sustain what's been entrusted to us, restore it where it's damaged, and improve it where we can. So, for example, Jesus, perfectly bearing the image of God and representing God among us, the only one who's ever perfectly borne God's image, what did he spend most of his life doing? Big hint in the image, right? Pardon? Carpentry, teknon, it's a builder or carpenter. So Jesus spent most of his life, just chronologically in terms of time, he spent most of his life taking natural materials like wood and stone and carving and shaping them to make plows, tables, doors, roof, shelter. He spent most of his life shaping the natural world to better care for the people that lived in it. Matthew 25 is a very interesting exposition in that it's not only what Jesus did, it's also what Jesus said. You remember that in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus tells his disciples, he warns them that he knows what's coming and that he's expecting that he will indeed be murdered by the government, by the Roman authorities. But then he tells them this remarkable promise that he's going to return. And of course, the natural question is, when? And so in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus gives 3 responses to that question in the next chapter. So the disciples say, well, when are you going to return? And Jesus tells the story of the 10 bridesmaids. And you've all heard and read it before. Remember, it's about the young women who've been invited to a wedding. They're very excited, but it's a nighttime wedding and they don't bring enough batteries for their flashlights. So they go to Walmart and get more batteries, and when they come back, they've missed the wedding. Okay? Does this sound vaguely familiar? Okay. All right. So the warning is that you need to come prepared for the long haul. It's going to be quite a while before he returns. And in fact, how long has it been so far? 2,000 years. That is a long haul. Okay? Not in God's time, but in our time. That sounds like a long time. So then the very natural question the disciples ask next is, okay, well, if you're going to leave us here for quite a while, what are we supposed to do in the meantime? And that's when Jesus tells the parable or the story of the talents. And talent is a handy word because it refers both to attributes and also in that day to money. So the fellow gives 10 talents to one servant, 5 talents to another, 1 to a third. He leaves. When he comes back, he asks, what have they done with their talents in the meantime? What have they been doing? The one with 10 says, I made 10 more. And the master says, well done. And he says to the one he gave 5 to, what have you done? He says, well, I've made 5 more. And the master again says, well done. And then he gets to the fellow who he gave 1 talent to, maybe with some foreshadowing of what he was going to do. And the fellow says, I just didn't know what to do, so I buried it, but I'm returning it to you now. And the master says, that's terrible. You had this resource entrusted to you and you didn't multiply it. You didn't use it well. So he takes away the one from that fellow and gives it to the guy who had 10. So the disciples say, when are you coming back? Jesus says, it's going to be quite a while. They say, what are you going to do in the meantime? Jesus tells the story of using the time well, of multiplying your resources for better service. So then the disciples say, well, tell us more about this service part, or better service, or what does it look like to multiply your talents? And that's when Jesus tells the story of the final day of judgment, where the angels go out to gather in the people who belong to him and separate them out from the people who don't. So there's a gathering in of God's people. And how do the angels recognize who belongs to God? To what purpose and in what way should we develop our entrusted resources? Well, Matthew 25 gives this long list. The people who are recognized as God's people are the ones who give water to the thirsty, the ones who give food to the hungry, who visit those in prison, who care for those who are sick, who clothe those who don't have enough to wear. That the people of God are characterized by their love and care for the people. That if you love God, you'll love what God loves. God cares about people. His people will care about people. So in Matthew 25, we see praise for those who were prepared for the long haul, who multiplied their entrusted resources and used them to care for their neighbors. It's quite clear there's also approbation. The text repeats everything again now with the negative. There's approbation for those who did not do what they could, who did not care for their neighbors when they could have helped. So I'm suggesting that part of our calling, bearing God's image, is to sustain the creation that belongs to God and it's been entrusted to us. Don't make it worse. Okay, sustain it. Restore it where we see there's been damage or harm, and improve it where we can. Would that include our bodies too, as part of the creation that's been entrusted to us? That's probably the part of creation you have the most control and effect on, right, is your body. Is that something that can be sustained, restored, and improved? Well, what was the sign that was mandated to Abraham to show that he and his descendants were the people of God? Right. There's a hint. Okay. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. The very sign that the God of the Hebrew Bible gives to his people to mark you are mine is to physically alter a normal male human body. All right, to change the body as received. All right. Maybe you've heard the saying, if you ignore your teeth, they'll go away. Certainly my mother used to tell me that regularly. And she'd want me to be very careful to explain this is not a picture of her. Right. So what do we do with our teeth, as an example? We should regularly brush them. We should sustain them. If you get a cavity, you should fill it. You should restore that cavity. And is it possible to improve your teeth? Well, I think of my daughters who've never had a cavity in their life. They, at regular intervals, have been given sealant on their teeth that actually makes their teeth stronger than natural enamel, and they've never even had a cavity. Pretty nice. Right? So even with our teeth, we can sustain and restore and improve. Do you recognize this condition? Yeah, this is a child with smallpox. Smallpox used to ravage our planet every year, killing tens of millions of people. And in fact, I'm pretty sure I can state right now that pretty much everybody in this room who's over the age of 50 has a scar on your left shoulder. And pretty much everybody in the room who is under 50 doesn't have a scar on their left shoulder. So what's that scar from? Vaccination for smallpox, exactly. Okay? Through tremendous effort, seeking to sustain, restore, and improve the world we've received, the creation we live in, we found out a way to vaccinate against smallpox and have pursued it on a global basis until we actually killed the species. That's pretty heavy stuff, to kill a species. I would argue that that was the proper course in that case, to eliminate the species of smallpox. Although granted, smallpox still exists in 2 cities of the world. There's still smallpox in Moscow and in Atlanta. Okay. Why those 2 locations? Yeah, in Atlanta, it's in the Centers for Disease Control. There's still smallpox deeply frozen and under security, so that if somehow it ever pops up again, we can quickly analyze with the smallpox that we have to figure out how to fight it and what to do with it. And there's the equivalent of the CDC in Moscow. But those are the only 2 places in the world where smallpox still exists. Okay? Is that a genuine improvement to the creation we've received? I would argue that it is. And there are literally hundreds of millions of human beings who can now live full lives because of that improvement. If you want to read about that amazing story of coming to understand smallpox and to eliminate it, this is a very fine page-turner that covers that story. So, what does God require of you? Micah 6:8, classic verse. What does God require of you? That you seek justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. It's interesting, there's a connection here with modern Western philosophy, people like James Childress or John Rawls, where they have their own list, but it parallels very closely. What can we expect? What should we expect of our fellow human beings? That we treat each other with fairness, justice, that we seek to help each other and not hurt each other, love kindness, and that we show respect for the views and concerns of others, especially with things that most directly affect them. And that's technically these days called respect for persons or autonomy. But I think it's the same idea as to walk humbly, to not insist on your own way, to seriously consider and take on what other people are concerned about. So if that's true, with this context we've just described, how would you decide that a particular genetic editing is appropriate? I would argue that we could ask 4 basic questions. I would say we should ask, number 1, is it safe for the recipient and anyone else directly involved? Prima non nocere. First, do no harm. At least don't make the patient worse. All right? So, first of all, is it safe for the recipients? 2, is it a genuine improvement? You might think that it would be great for your kid to help them to be 7'5" for playing on a basketball team. However, that is actually awkward in the way of their becoming a gymnast or fitting into the average car. I mean, there's a real question whether that would be a genuine improvement. 3rd, does it increase the recipient's choices? You don't want to predestine people. You don't want to try to make people into your own desires or images. But are there things you can do that would help them to have more choices in the future? What if, for example, some people naturally have a greater resistance to cancer than other people do? What if we read the genetic recipe for that and then we gave it to more people? It's almost a kind of vaccination against cancer. Does that make that person become a carpenter or an attorney? No, it actually increases their choices. Now they can live a full life without having to deal with cancer. It increases their choices. I think of Mrs. Taubert in 1st grade, who with a loving but iron hand taught me to read. Did that predestine me? No, she actually was empowering me. She gave me an ability that I could then read whatever I wanted, and that opened up whole worlds. There are skills and abilities you can impart that increase your choices, not decrease them. So it's not one generation lording it over the next, it's one generation freeing the next. And then I'd ask, is this the best use of always finite resources? There's never enough to do everything. So when we're thinking about the resources of individuals or families or communities or churches or hospitals or schools or the country, it's very appropriate to ask, is this the best use of always finite resources in a particular case? Okay. Changing our received nature could never offer us salvation or utopia. I want to be very clear about that. But we can and should tend the garden and help our neighbors. All right, help me out here. A gathering of cows is a herd. A gathering of whales is a pod. A gathering of crows is a murder. Okay, good. Of geese is a gaggle. Of lions, a pride. Of ethicists. I will propose we should call a gathering of ethicists a worry. A worry of ethicists would work. That just really fits. I'm going to suggest that Christian ethics serves an important purpose when it warns us of the danger of pride, but it should also warn us of the danger of apathy. It tells us what not to do, but it should also remind and encourage us as to what we should do. Christian ethics is neither lawless nor legalist. It's about being set free through and in Christ to live as God created us to live. Ken Untner wrote in honor of Oscar Romero, the Catholic bishop, God's kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our comprehension. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. We plant seeds that will one day grow. We water seeds already planted. We lay foundations that will need further development. We add yeast that produces far beyond our capabilities. What we do is but a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter. We are workers, not the master builder, ministers, not the Messiah. So you notice I'm calling for doing the best we can with what we have, and that we shouldn't be apathetic or idle when we have an opportunity to love and serve and help our neighbor. We should. Gene editing has some marvelous opportunities to be helpful, but to the degree we use it, we need to be very careful that we don't cause harm. And we need to use it in a way that's most beneficial and encouraging and helpful to our neighbors. And realize that it's not going to be our salvation. It's not going to be utopia. But it is amazing what positive goods it can be. May we do our part prayerfully, thoughtfully, wisely, out of love for God, one another, and the rest of creation that God has entrusted to us. If you'd like to see this argument in more detail, this is a book that I've written on this particular topic. Any bookstore could order it, or Amazon can have it printed for you. So easy to get if you're interested. So let's talk some very concrete cases doing gene editing. Right? And I'll ask this first one. Should we gene edit, use genetic editing like CRISPR, to change the recipe in some of a patient's white blood cells to give them the ability to recognize the particular cancer cells that are attacking a person's body, so that those cells now have an address, they now have a direction, they now know what they're looking for, and they go and find the cancer cells and destroy them. So in other words, you're giving an ability to your body's own natural leukocytes or white blood cells to more quickly recognize and destroy the cancer. Right now, you have cancer cells in your body. We all do. And your leukocytes find those cancer cells and destroy them before they can multiply and become a full case of cancer. What would you think about using a gene editing tool, take the white blood cells out, alter them so that they know specifically what cancer to look for, drip them back into the bloodstream, They search your body, and any of that cancer they can find, they engulf and eat and destroy. So, should we do that? Yes. And then I'll take a no. Yes. Should we not do that? No. Okay. Want to know more about it? Okay. What kinds of things would you want to know?
I'd want to know if there's a possibility.
We have the problem with chemotherapy. Chemotherapy, at its root, just destroys any cell that's multiplying rapidly. And so not only does it kill the cancer that's multiplying rapidly, it kills your hair cells, it kills the lining of your intestines. I mean, chemotherapy makes you so sick and so devastating because it kills lots of things besides the cancer. The beauty of this therapy I'm describing to you is that you're putting an address on the white blood cells so that the only thing it will attack is the cancer that is hurting you. So there's no reason to expect that it would attack anything else. Incidentally, this is already happening. I'm describing a therapy that is being tested right now and seems to be quite successful. So it's whenever we start a new therapy, we do it with just a few people and then a few more and then a few more to make sure we're not missing something. But so far, it doesn't seem to be harmful to anyone. The white blood cells, they're your white blood cells. You're just giving them directions. Here's something you should be sure to remove. Well, I mean, it's giving a identification marker genetically to the white blood cell saying, here's something you should look for. So it's changing the genes in that white blood cell because it's targeting it for a particular cell to look for and destroy. Right. Oh, yes, sir.
Oh, great. I get the microphone. In some sense, this is basically just an extension of immunization. In that
Yes.
immunization, you're introducing a foreign substance that directs the genetics of that white blood cell to fight. And it's inside the body. Mm-hmm. You're talking about just removing it and giving it a little better direction.
Yeah, with a vaccination, you introduce something that the body can recognize as foreign and harmful so that the body gets used to spotting that and attacking it. This is more precise in that you tell a particular cell, this is what you need to look for. But I think you're right. You could call it a kind of vaccination. Yes, sir.
Jim, what we're doing here, if we say yes, is we're prolonging the life of someone who might have died. Is that fair to say?
In a number of cases already, we have cured them of cancer, so then they lead a normal life otherwise.
If we extend this into other treatments, are we bordering on giving people immortality? And what do we do with that?
Yeah, the question of extending lifespan is very lively. I mean, that's a real question. There are people who are treating aging process as a disease, and so they're trying to tackle why does your body age and can they stop that? That's quite a bit further down the line. Nobody's been able to do that very precisely yet. Although we are already successful significantly, you realize that we all live a heck of a lot longer than even our parents' generation, or our parents did better than their parents' generation. We're already living a lot longer than people used to. Can gene editing be used to extend lifespan? Quite possibly. And then that's a whole other set of questions we'd need to address. Very, very appropriate to raise. All right. Okay. False positive. What would that mean? Part of what is so impressive about CRISPR is that you can put as long an address on it as you want. And you can put on a very long address that has so many matching points that have to be present. It's very precise. It's sort of like you're making a key that can fit into a lock that has so many different numbers to the lock that it's just going to go to that one particular lock. And so actually that's part of what gets people excited about CRISPR is how specific it is, how precise it is. If you put in a long address, the chance of it going to the wrong place very quickly becomes infinitesimal. So yes, you want to make sure you're not causing harm. Very true. Okay, another case to consider. A child is born with cleft palate and a split lip that will make it difficult to speak and eat. Should we A, do surgery to bring the palate and lip together so that they can speak and eat freely? Or should we not do surgery because God chose these genes and this result for that particular child? All right, so how many think they would go with A, do surgery? How many people might say, B, don't do surgery because this is God's plan for that child? Okay, at least nobody's raising their hand right now for that. It's certainly our standard of care. It's our common practice. When a child is born, it's not at all unusual with cleft palate or split lip. We do surgery almost immediately so that they'll be able to eat and speak freely in the future. That's not manipulating the child or treating them like a thing. That's acting because you care about the child and want them to be able to have those basic capabilities. So we do that surgically now. Okay? A child is born with cleft palate and a split lip that will make it difficult to speak and eat. Should we correct the child's genetic code so that her palate and lip grow together normally from the beginning? In other words, the cleft palate and split lip are occurring because there is an error in the genetic instructions. If we could fix the genetic instructions so that in the womb the child grows a normal lip and roof of the mouth without any surgery, should we do that? How many would say, yes, if you can, you should? How many would say, no, that's going too far or wrong? Okay, well, that would be an example of what we're thinking about and trying to decide. Is if you can avoid the surgery and the risk of infection and the suffering and the pain and correct it so it grows right in the first place, wouldn't that be a great blessing for the child? A child is born with cleft palate and a split lip that will make it difficult to speak and eat. Should we correct the child's genetic code so that her palate and lip grow together normally from the beginning and her children will not need treatment in the future? Or should we just correct it so that her cleft palate and lip grow normally, but we'll have to do it every generation? We won't, in other words, we'll let her pass on that inheritance. We'll just fix it for her. How many would say, yes, we should eliminate it for her children as well? How many would say, no, that's affecting inheritance, we shouldn't do that? Well, but this is a serious question. Remember last week we talked about somatic and germline? I'm just being very concrete, an example of the question. Currently, the federal government will support research, and there's no criminal penalty for doing somatic therapy, what affects the first patient. Currently, there's a ban on doing intentional germline therapy, which is where you make the change in such a way that it's inherited, simply because there isn't a full consensus yet as a society that the germline's appropriate. Now, it appears that in this particular room, it would have passed just fine. So just to be aware, that's a line that some people will draw between somatic and germline. Okay? It's true, if you make the germline intervention, you're making decisions for a future generation you haven't seen or consulted. But then again, what's the chance that a future generation will say, my gosh, we really wanted to have split lip, and we really wanted to have a roof of the mouth that didn't meet. I mean, you're probably pretty safe. What if a future generation said, no, there's some benefit to this we weren't aware of? Well, if you know how to change it, you could change it back, I suppose. And you shouldn't do it for the first patient unless you're sure that it's going to be a benefit and not a harm. So just be aware, this is where one of the current discussions is going. Okay, a couple is using IVF, in vitro fertilization. What percentage of couples who want to have a baby are open to that in their sexual intimacy for a year and don't conceive? Any idea? It's about 1 in 5. All right, so needing help with fertility is actually a very common experience. What some people eventually need to do to have a biological child of their own is to use IVF, in vitro fertilization, where you bring the sperm and the egg together in a dish outside the body. Okay? Let's say a couple is using IVF to have children. It is clear that one of the embryos has the genetic code for cleft palate and split lip. Now, it's the nature of when you do this that usually you bring together sperm and egg and you end up with more eggs than you can implant. So you have, say, 10 fertilized eggs. Should that embryo that has the gene for cleft palate and split lip be implanted along with those that will grow normally? So at this point, as you're starting to think about this, how many of you would say that if you read the genes ahead and you know there's one of those 10 embryos has the gene, they're going to have cleft palate and split lip for that person and for those who follow, how many of you would say you should implant that embryo? How many of you would say, well, that would be a reason not to implant that particular embryo? So how many would say, yes, implant it? How many would say, don't implant it? Okay, a big part of what's happening here is there's the whole discussion of when do we recognize that there's a fellow human being present. If an embryo has the full moral status of a fellow human being, you don't take away their life by not implanting them because they have a handicap or something that needs to be dealt with. On the other hand, if that's not a fellow human being yet, then you're not ending someone's life. You're just trying to make sure you have the best possible start for the child that is eventually born. Okay. So your understanding of when there's a full human being present makes a huge difference, and that's a big discussion. We can do another Sunday school if you'd like about how people have thought about that. Okay. A couple is using IVF to have children. They have 2 sons that they love, but would like to have a girl too. Would it be okay only to implant the female embryos? Okay. All right, so I'm just giving you very concrete examples of the kinds of decisions that people are making and need to make, and encouraging you to be aware of them and to start thinking through how we should handle these things. Okay? Our time's going quickly. Let me give you some resources. The American Scientific Affiliation, which you can find on the web at asa3.org, is a tremendous organization. It's composed of literally thousands of people who are either full-time research scientists or teaching science or very interested in the sciences, who also affirm the Apostles' Creed. So there are Christians who are active in the sciences. This includes names you'll probably recognize. For example, Francis Collins is a member. Francis Collins discovered the gene for cystic fibrosis. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, and he's currently the director of the National Institutes of Health. Okay. Jennifer Wiseman was the senior project scientist for the Hubble Space Telescope. Robert Kaita is a key player in the Fusion Project at Princeton. Rosalind Picard is the founder of the Effective Computing Program at MIT, where they teach computers to recognize human emotion and to express emotion. So all kinds of really interesting people, and there's a website where you can tap all kinds of resources related to thinking about Christian faith and leading edge of science. And I'll just note, if you know any students, membership is free for a student. Anybody can use the web. Another site I'd strongly recommend is called testoffaith.com. Testoffaith.com has 3-minute interviews with over 30 scientists, each one on about 10 different questions. So it's hours of, but in short little segments, where you can think of a question you're interested in, and then you can just click and hear how these different people responded. And so some examples would be Francis Collins, Rosalind Picard, and Jennifer Wiseman that I just mentioned. John Polkinghorne, the molecular physicist who is the president of Queen's College at Cambridge University. Alistair McGrath, Ard Lewis, just a long list of really interesting people, very articulate, very engaged, and so fascinating site to explore. All right. And so that leaves us with about 5 minutes for any other questions or comments that you'd like to raise. Do you want to wait for a mic or? Okay.
I think, if I remember correctly, one of the characteristics you listed earlier of the people of God was related to the way the product of God, the human body, is cared for, nourished, made well. And after listening to this discussion, it seems fairly obvious that the degree to which that can be done is much more a choice of the community than of the individual.
So to what degree is taking care of one person's body, individual or community? I think it's very much both, isn't it? My health and your health are affected by the health of others, and that's why we have the whole discipline of public health. So choices that are made by a community about health do affect everyone, that's true. And there are choices that the community has resources to do, like to develop a vaccine that an individual doesn't. But probably the person who has the greatest effect on your individual health is you, because you can choose about what you eat, how much you exercise, how much you rest. Do you get that vaccination? I mean, there are all kinds of very formative choices that you make. So I think you're quite right that it's a real combination, and that we're responsible for what we do for ourselves, but then we're also responsible for how we input into the community and into other institutions. So there are all kinds of things we can do as a church, or we can do as a college or a hospital, things we can do as taxpayers, for state level, national level. It's a highly complex, interactive system. And so I would just at the base say we're each responsible to do the best we can with what we have, remembering it's God's creation and we're responsible before God for what we do with that creation, ourselves and others included. So good point that it's on all those levels, very true. You have a mic and other questions?
The story of 3 servants who were given
The talents, right.
Yeah, talents.
Matthew 25.
Yes. So the last one, he did not increase with 1 talent. Now, prior to that, I remember he was just saying about the master, how harsh he was, how punishing he was, how he wants something from nothing, right? So I was thinking, what's the implication of that? So when I'm reading that, it makes a lot of sense to me. I would be so afraid to go out and do anything. So if in case I lose that 1 talent, right? So I put it under my mattress and just give back to him. But that was not regarded or accepted as diligent servant. So to me, we also have to address the servant's, as obviously his mental, emotional, spiritual state at that point, or perhaps he misunderstood. So what does the gospel try to tell us? So that is not if that master is portrayed as God. That's not God, right? God is love. I mean, John says so. So is it trying to clarify that? Or perhaps, regardless of anything and everything, we should just be gung-ho about it and just go out and, try to increase it.
Yeah, I would argue that a parable is a story with a point. That, as you're pointing out, it's important that you don't start to take every aspect of the story and draw a parallel. This must be God, this must be so-and-so, this is doing that. You're listening for what's the underlying point, what's the statement at the end that summarizes what Jesus is trying to get across. And so I think in the parable of the talents, the point is not that God is unjust or harsh or unreasonable. The point is that one should do the best you can with what you have. And God knows what you have. God knows your history. God knows your psychological abilities. God knows your mental health. God knows everything about who you are. And God is very gracious and loving and gives second chances and deeply cares. But he's also one who expects you to do the best you can with what you have. Another example is that Jesus talks about people coming into the kingdom by faith as a child, receiving the free gift of grace. But then what do we all expect a child to do? We expect them to grow up. That over time more is expected and they can do more and they want to do more. They want to help, right? So that I think the underlying idea is, yes, God is very forgiving and gracious and welcomes us where we are, but he also loves us too much to leave us alone. He wants to help us thrive. He wants to help us flourish, and that involves learning and growth and effort, so that we read from the Apostle Paul, he says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, because it's God who's at work with you. So God is at work in us. We do the very best we can, but we can always do the best we can knowing that God knows us and loves us and is willing to work with us where we are and cares enough to help us move forward. So I think it's a combination there to think about. God doesn't want to just leave us in our old stew, right?
Right. Well, good. Well, thank you very much. And this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Dr. Peterson, for this. And you can thank him while you're here. Go ahead. Thank you very much. Yeah, we've enjoyed it. And brings up lots more questions for us to talk about. Maybe we'll have you back sometime and we can keep going. It's not like this conversation is going away.
No.
If anything, it would probably only become more heightened and deep in its sense of wrestling and struggling with these questions as we go forward. So, all right, thank you very much, and we'll see everyone next week.